live, so welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. And as we get started, please feel free to put in the chat your name, any organization or affiliation you have, your location. We have folks joining us from all over, and how you hope to use what you learn in today's session. Welcome to the first session of our workshop, Be Informed, What is ICE, How do they operate? This is part one of a part two series. As we get started, we're going to do some housekeeping. If we can move to the next slide, please. And as we move to the slide, I'll start. So we've gotten a lot of questions about whether or not we're recording this training, and we'll be sharing it. We are recording the training. What's being recorded is only the presenters and the slides. Anything that's in the chat will not be recorded. We will be sharing the recording and the slides after both of the trainings. Again, this is part one of a two-part training. There's Spanish interpretation available. There were just instructions on how to join, so hopefully everyone is able to access that. Please put any questions you have in the chat. We may not respond immediately, but we have colleagues who are tracking them in real time. So we will try to answer anything that comes up during this training, or some that might be useful for next week's training. Any tech issues, you should reach out to OnPoint Studio at this email address. And just a note on language as we get started, for the purpose of our training, we're using the term non-citizen to refer to people in the United States who are not US citizens. So we just wanted to define that before we start using it. And before we introduce ourselves, I just want to say some thank yous. We have a team of people supporting us behind the scenes today. So thanks to OnPoint Studio, to Geronimo and Lauren, to Lars and Maria, who are providing Spanish interpretation, to our colleagues Em and Gabby, who are helping us with the chat and who will be leading next week's training. So with that, we can move to the next slide and introduce ourselves. So my name is Zhenya Blazer. I'm a supervising attorney with the Immigrant Defense Project. IDP fights to protect and expand the rights of all immigrants, with a particular focus on immigrants accused or convicted of crimes. And relevant to this training, we've been monitoring ICE policing and community arrests in the New York area for a decade. And I will let Ali introduce themselves.
Thanks, Zhenya. Hello, everyone. Really happy to be here. My name is Ali Finn. I'm the senior researcher and organizer with the Surveillance Resistance Lab. The lab takes on state and corporate surveillance as one of the greatest threats that we face to migrant, racial, and economic justice. Some of you may know our work in its previous iteration. We were the Surveillance, Tech, and Immigration Policing Project, housed at IDP until branching off into a new organization at the beginning of this year. But we're very excited to continue partnering with IDP on initiatives like this. And the lab is also New York City based. We do campaign incubation, advocacy, and organizing to divest from technologies that expand systems of control and punishment, both in and at the border, but also beyond in other areas. I'll pass back to Zhenya. Thanks.
Thanks. And if we can go to the next slide, we actually have a poll to get a sense of sort of who's joining us today, what people are hoping to get out of the training. If Geronimo and Lauren, you're able to launch the poll. We want to get a sense of what best describes the information you have before the training, before coming to the training, whether or not, you came, you're not sure what ICE is, you're looking for a 101. Broadly what ICE policing is, but you're excited to learn more. Maybe you facilitate Know Your Rights trainings about ICE. I know many people can probably select more than one, but if you just pick one, and then Geronimo and Lauren, if you can share the results when everyone has done it, then we can see who's in the room. I'm actually not sure if the results are showing, but I think I'm gonna keep on going. Just for the interest of time, we have a lot of information we want to start the training with. And so The goal of this training and sort of the agenda for today is we want to give everyone a baseline understanding of ICE policing. We want to talk about the political history of the Department of Homeland Security, the current moment we're in, how ICE operates and gets information, recent tactics in ICE policing and surveillance, ways to plug in and fight back. And then session 2 next week will really focus on know your rights with ICE and what to do during an encounter with ICE. And just a note before Ali starts us off, both of us are New York based. So a lot of the examples we use are New York examples, but please in the chat, if you're seeing similar things where you live, feel free to share with all of us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ali.
Great, thank you so much, Zhenya. So we're going to start with a quick overview of the political and historical context of the Department of Homeland Security to contextualize why we are here today. And we do this because many people have entered into immigration justice work in the last 5 years, especially under Trump's presidency. We want to make sure that we all have a bit of a baseline of historical context of what happened before. So some, if not many of you will be familiar with this information already. If yes, we encourage you, instead of checking out, to tune in a little bit closer and think about how you might present this information and share this information with others in the future. We encourage you to drop ideas into the chat as well. I just want to pause quickly and check if my audio is okay, because I'm getting some messages that it might be too quiet, and I don't want to continue until that's resolved. Okay. So next slide, please. To understand our current moment, we need to know how we got here. As many of us are familiar, the history of what we're calling the US is really one of exclusion of different communities and different individuals. What we see over time is that communities that are seen by the government as other are framed as threats, and that justifies their expulsion and deportation. This is at the core of settler colonialism, as we know, and really the founding of the US. And this has been applied both to citizens and non-citizens. It's often about who is perceived or allowed to be a citizen, in addition to the actual papers that people hold. So, to really grossly condense, hundreds of years of history into one slide, we can see some examples here from the initial laws stripping indigenous nations of their rights within this country, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, internment of people of Japanese descent, targeting of leftists, anarchists, labor organizers. It all, has a very familiar and repetitive frame. And we see coming into the 20th century, a bit of a shift or an amplification of what was going on before with the criminalization of migration itself. In 1929, the US criminalized illegal entry and re-entry with a goal at the time of controlling labor flows of people from Mexico. And this was an expansion, but also a shift in that it was criminalized and led to tens of thousands of people being convicted of unlawful re-entry and entry, as well as building of prisons on the US-Mexico border region. Next slide, please. So the founding of the Department of Homeland Security. What does Homeland Security have to do with all of this? We highlight this because DHS was founded after 9/11 in 2002. And this was the largest restructuring of the federal government since the end of the Second World War. This is key because because it brought together all of the immigration agencies under a Homeland Security lens for the first time. For that, immigration agencies were scattered in different parts of the federal government. So it put all of the immigration agencies, as well as others, under this issue of Homeland Security. And what that did is it supercharged this ongoing project of criminalization by fueling billions and billions of dollars into border militarization, immigration detention, mass deportation, and surveillance. And the Department of Homeland Security's goal of securing the American homeland actually expanded their territory to the whole planet, as well as hyper-locally. And it reframed immigration, as well as the economic system, and all matters of security under this mandate, with the response becoming more policing, more surveillance, and more punishment. Next slide, please. So what did this actually do? We saw an explosion of the police force at the border and in the interior, a huge growth of detention and the mass deportation system, ramping up of the border wall, and surveillance technology at the border and throughout the country. And immigration policing becomes kind of one tool in DHS's arsenal through this. Next slide, please. We're going to share the slides after so you can see these numbers, but this just shows how border fencing increased before and after the founding of DHS and how the number of Border Patrol agents exploded. And the other thing that happened with the stepping into the scene of DHS is it changed the role of local police as well. So prior, domestic police did not play the same role in immigration enforcement, but with the founding of DHS, local police became force multipliers for this project of immigration enforcement. And much of both ICE policing as well as ICE surveillance relies on information sharing and deputizing of local police. Next slide, please. We put this sentence on a slide because it is worth really paying attention to this point. DHS and ICE feed off and rely on the racially biased and classist criminal legal system and the logics of punishment and incarceration that underlie the criminal legal system. So much like the prison industrial complex thrives on fear, fueled by racism and lies, fueled by racism and economic inequity, DHS really centers certain groups of non-citizens as a perpetual threat, and that is very much built in the same biases and discriminatory systems. So what we see is that mass deportation has come to mirror mass incarceration. Decades of discriminatory policing has both extended ICE policing because there's an enormous range of convictions that can trigger deportation. And it also means that ICE has a huge pool of people they can target, and arrest and conviction rates reflect the racial and class bias of who is targeted for arrest outside of immigration enforcement in domestic policing systems. Since 9/11, we also see the increased targeting of Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and other communities extending to Central American youth. Again, just who is perceived as a threat changes, but that is used to justify the very existence of DHS and ICE policing systems. Next slide, please. We often talk about immigration and ICE policing as a partisan issue, but what we've seen over time is there's actually a lot of consensus between the parties. So if we're talking about deportation, here on the slide, we can see that in the 8 years under Bush, we had the same number of deportations as the 100+ years before. So you can really see the role of founding of DHS in increasing prosecutions and deportations. And then we also see that this increased even further under Obama, our deporter-in-chief, who relied on the same criminalization rhetoric to increase deportation. He really focused on these ideas of security, targeting felons, targeting criminals, targeting gang members, and contrasting people labeled with those categories from families. I'm going to pass to Zhenya to talk about our current moment under Biden.
And we can go to the next slide. So we're 2 years into the Biden administration right now, and what we've seen is that there has been a reversal of some of the Trump era policies like the Muslim ban, large workplace arrests, the rescinding of DACA, although of course that's being litigated in the courts, the public charge rule. We've seen an increase in the electronic monitoring of non-citizens through ankle monitors, through SmartLink and other cell phone technologies. And what we've really seen is that there's a continuation of many of the Trump era and previous administration policies that criminalize immigrants and that are applied disproportionately towards Black immigrants. So like Title 42 expulsions, there are rumors of a return to family detention. And we've seen how the Biden administration continues to prioritize targeting immigrants, targeting non-citizens who are deemed so-called threats to border security, national security, and public safety, relying on the same logic of policing and criminalization, like Ali talked about a little bit. And to close out this section, I just want to end by reminding everyone, which many likely know, is that the deportation system is a machine, regardless of who is in charge, which administration, what party they belong to. And the themes that are really inherent to the roots of the system, criminalization, rhetoric around who is a threat and who belongs, continues with every policy, with every piece of the system. And so with that, we're going to shift to talk about how ICE gets information and talk a little bit more about the agencies within the Department of Homeland Security.
And as Zhenya shifts, just want to drop in a reminder that we are welcoming questions in the chat. We don't see them quite in real time, but we will loop back to them. So please drop in any questions you have, especially clarification as we speak. Back to Zhenya.
Thanks, Ali. Okay, so this next section, we're going to focus on how ICE gets information, how they learn about non-citizens. And this is not a comprehensive section. We want to really give an overview of the three main immigration agencies that exist within the Department of Homeland Security, how they work together, how they work with outside actors to identify non-citizens to arrest and deport. And the reasons we want to do this is because these agencies are incredibly opaque. And so we want to try to break it down a little bit so there's more information out there. Next slide. So all of the immigration agencies under the Department of Homeland Security, which again was established in 2002, help to identify people for ICE to target and deport or try to deport. So we're going to go through these three agencies in the next slide. So we can actually move to the next one. So the first agency is Customs and Border Protection, often called Border Patrol. CBP agents are stationed at the land and coastal borders or ports of entries like airports. And they claim to have authority within 100 miles of all external boundaries, including land borders, coastal borders, airports of the United States, which if you look at the map, it covers a wide swath of the United States. It covers about 2/3 of the people that live in this country. CBP agents are charged with customs. They have the power to let individuals enter the US or turn them away at ports of entries. And whenever they encounter individuals, one thing they do is they take biometrics, which includes fingerprints and other information, and they put this in a database which is shared within DHS and with the other agencies within DHS. Next slide. Okay, so this is USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So this is the agency that is charged with handling affirmative immigration applications. So this would be if you apply for a green card, if you're renewing the green card, if you're renewing work permits, if you're applying for citizenship, any affirmative application before USCIS, one of the first things that happens after you get a receipt notice is that you're asked for your biometrics, which again includes fingerprints and other information like biographics, and that is all shared internally within the different DHS agencies, including with ICE. Next slide. And then the last agency is ICE. And so ICE is the interior policing arm of the Department of Homeland Security. And their mission the mission of ICE and its sub-agencies is to locate and deport non-citizens that they believe are removable. And the two sub-agencies that we want to sort of highlight today are Enforcement and Removal Operations, ERO, and Homeland Security Investigations, HSI. ERO, those are the officers that many people might encounter sort of on the ground who are in real time locating and arresting non-citizens to deport. And HSI is the Criminal Investigative Agency. They work on many joint task force with state and federal law enforcement and other agencies, and they're also working to locate non-citizens for deportation. Next slide.
So DHS cannot do this alone. And we wanted to highlight some of the corporations here that provide much of the infrastructure, technology, and software that DHS relies on to track, target, arrest, detain, and deport non-citizens. What we've seen, especially over the last 20 years, is that immigration enforcement and detention have become a big business for both Silicon Valley and military contractors. And that billions of taxpayer dollars are going to contracts with these companies to procure and maintain these systems. Many of these are household names, as you can see. This is not a all-inclusive list either. There's many more, but I just want to highlight two. So Amazon, many of us know, use it frequently, perhaps. Amazon co-owns an airline involved in deportation flights and also cloud hosts a number of DHS systems, as do other companies. And LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters are two companies that you might know because they provide legal and journalistic research products. They also build their business off of working as data brokers for DHS, which means that they collect and analyze and then package and resell people's intimate personal information to help ICE create dossiers, profiles on people to figure out where they are and what they do. We'll talk more about this in a later section, and I will pass back to Zhenya. Meanwhile, Gabby is putting in the chat a link about Amazon's role in deportation flights.
Thanks, Allie. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So like Allie mentioned, ICE can't do this alone. They can't target non-citizens on their own without relying on the other agencies within the Department of Homeland Security, without relying on some of the corporate partners that Allie highlighted, and without relying on local police and the criminal legal system as a way to identify and target non-citizens for arrest. We have another poll that I think actually, in the interest of time, we're going to skip, but we can go to the next slide and I'll explain what we're going to cover in the poll, which is that at the time of an arrest by local police, fingerprints get automatically shared with ICE. So even in areas like New York City, which has policies in place to protect non-citizens, fingerprints are shared not actually through the local police themselves, but through the state databases with the FBI database, which is a national database to which DHS has access. So basically, if you're arrested by the police and you're fingerprinted at a precinct when you go through central booking, those prints are automatically shared with a database that immigration has access to. And then they might be able to determine whether you are someone that they want to target for an arrest. And along with the fingerprint information, often place of birth is shared. So someone who might already be in DHS's system, so for example, if you have a green card, immigration already has your fingerprint information because you had to share it with USCIS when you applied for your green card. And they might have a hit in their system and then look into whether or not they believe you could be at risk of deportation. If someone's not in DHS's system, so for example, someone who's completely undocumented, who never had any contact with immigration, but who is born outside of the United States, when the fingerprints are shared with the place of birth, which is not within the US, that might cause immigration to look into this person to investigate whether or not they want to target them for arrest. Next slide. And once someone ends up on ICE's radar, so if there's a hit in the system from the fingerprints and other information, ICE will then conduct digital and ultimately physical surveillance to locate the non-citizen. And we're going to discuss what this looks like, but some of the ways that they do this is they might rely on jails to turn over people to ICE if there's a detainer or an immigration hold. They might target people in the community to arrest them, so physically go out into the community. And they might use information from police bookings or other publicly available information to learn about future court dates so they can kind of track someone's movements. So I'm going to stop there. Allie, I don't know if there are any questions that came up in this section. Yeah.
We have two quick questions. One I'll take and then one I will pass to you, Zhenya. Someone asked if there's any links on info about Salesforce and ICE. In the next section, I'll drop in some links for you in a little bit. And then Anna had a question about when a person is processed on the border, are they processed by one of these agencies? I think referring to ICE, CBP, and USCIS are all 3. Zhenya, do you want to clarify that quickly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when somebody is stopped at the border, it's likely to be CBP because they are the agency that is generally very present at the border, but that's not just because they interpret the border areas to be within 100 miles of an external border. You know, there might also be ICE agents. There might also be HSI agents, of course, which are part of ICE, but it's likely CBP. Although it could be another immigration agent.
Great, thank you so much. Please keep dropping questions in the chat. We're kind of getting to them at the end of each of the sections. So we're going to move forward to talk a little bit about ICE surveillance. Can you go to the next slide, please? So by the time that ICE shows up to arrest someone, there is so much that has happened before. A lot of it is behind the scenes and incredibly hard to see. This is by design, right? ICE as an agency has a huge budget and is incredibly non-transparent. So what we're going to do in this section is to take a few minutes to break down some aspects of what ICE's surveillance machine looks like, kind of pull back the curtain a little bit. The goal here is not to explain or to make us experts on any particular surveillance technologies. And that's because ICE's surveillance systems and the technologies are kind of constantly mutating and updating. It can be really overwhelming to try to push back in that way because it always feels like it's moving faster than we possibly can. So instead, our aim is to try to understand the systems as a whole, to get the big picture and spark curiosity that can drive forward our organizing. If you're interested in learning more about particular aspects of ICE or police surveillance, please do follow up with us at the Surveillance Resistance Lab. Always happy to talk and connect you to other resources. We're going to go to a poll before the next slide. So wonderful on point team. I'm going to pause to let you put that up, and please let me know when we have the results. Great, and we have our poll results asking where ICE gets information. I see that most people said pretty much everything on the list, which is correct. We can go to the next slide, please. I see some results are still trickling in, so apologies if I just ruined your guess. So ICE surveillance really relies on collecting and analyzing people's personal data. And as we see in the poll and on this slide, ICE collects information from a truly overwhelming number and variety of databases, pulling all of this information together from these different sources on one person. And this slide that you see is too much, right? It's in a way, it's intentionally overwhelming, and it's just a sample of the data that ICE collects. So we're trying to visualize here a bit of what we don't see. What I do want to highlight from this slide is that ICE is collecting data from a mix of both public and private sources. In addition to what we talked about with data sharing with other DHS agencies, this includes information sharing from federal, state, local, tribal police, other countries' governments, interactions with the criminal legal system, gang databases, and predictive policing, so sources that there's already a public discourse around their racial bias and their the problems of relying on predictive policing and algorithmic systems, private company databases, and in many states even DMV information. And what I do want to say about this is that there are some differences city and state to state because of local policies. So I encourage you to get engaged more locally if you have questions about how this impacts you in your particular geography. Next slide, please. ICE relies on a mix of both explicit and implicit surveillance technologies. And we see this because for the past decade, IDP has been tracking ICE raids in New York City, which is also the origins of the Surveillance Resistance Lab. And over that decade, we saw a real increased reliance on surveillance technologies in addition to human surveillance. Some of what the explicit surveillance tech looks like: these are technologies directly designed to support ICE and police. So things like biometrics collection, right? The collecting of face scans, iris scans, fingerprints, DNA, social media surveillance, surveillance of public protest, use of license plate readers, which track in real time and historically what vehicles pass by a particular spot. We know from this report that recently came out called American Dragnet, which Gabby will put in the chat, that ICE tracks the movements of cars in cities home to nearly 70% of adults in the US. And much of these technologies are used by local police. So like we mentioned before, just as police themselves have become force multipliers for DHS, and ICE policing, they're also kind of force multipliers of this surveillance machine as well. And there's a big reliance on local policing surveillance tactics. And the last thing I'll say here is that all of these tools are used to surveil both citizens and non-citizens. So DHS doesn't just surveil people of various communities who are considered non-citizens, but also others it deems as threats. So after 9/11, the targeting of Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities, racial justice protesters, the list really goes on and on. Next slide, please. Part of what we're grappling with, however, and why this is so hard to push back against is because ICE also uses, ICE surveillance relies on a much wider array of technologies beyond those explicitly intended to serve ICE and police surveillance. So these are technologies or data capture tools where surveillance becomes the secondary function in a way. So some of these are through smart city technologies. Smart city tech is often implemented by governments in close collaboration with corporations. These are technologies designed often to make city services more efficient, or sometimes even ostensibly to increase access to services. These are things like tap and go transit systems, or smart chips on IDs, or smart street lamps, things that might seem like they're contributing to a public good, but are in reality used to extract massive amounts of data on residents and funnel that either to help corporations make money or perhaps also to help this project of policing, or both. But because corporations frame this technology as neutral, it's often adopted as a solution by other kind of city governments I would say city agencies, without understanding all of the implications. And the other way that this kind of implicit surveillance happens, although implicit maybe does not put credit where credit is due. But the other way that this happens is through capture of people's data through their day-to-day activities. So for example, utility data is a huge pool of information for ICE. ICE has information on 74% of adults in the US from when they connected to gas, electricity, phone, or the internet in a new home. That also comes from the American Dragnet report. Next slide, please. So what does all of this gathering of information do, right? Both through explicit surveillance technologies as well as this data capture from every aspect of our lives. ICE doesn't just use surveillance to watch people, but also to identify people, to track and monitor where they go, to label them as a threat, which makes them easier in ICE's context and in our criminal legal system to justify arresting and deporting them. So surveillance as it plays out is used to deny people rights, their ability to enter the country and travel, to be with family, to stay, to access benefits. And it also is used to kind of redefine who does and quote unquote doesn't belong and label people as a threat. Next slide, please. And just really quickly, we're running a little bit out of time. So again, encourage questions on this and we can send this out as follow-up. The role of corporations is huge here. Currently, about 10% of DHS's $44 billion budget is dedicated to data management. That number might be slightly out of date, but it's pretty much it's pretty close. And what we see is that corporations are really invested in this kind of revolving door, which has entrenched their role in this business ecosystem. And we've worked with a number of groups, including Mi Gente, Just Futures Law, other partners you see on the screen to uncover some of these corporations. Gabby will drop in a few reports that we and others have published if you're interested in learning more. But we highlight this because it's a key opportunity for organizing and resistance against ICE policing. I'm going to pass back to Zhenya to see if we have any questions that came up from this. We know it's a lot. We know we're moving fast, but hopefully we can pause for just 2 minutes and see what we have in the chat.
Ali, while people are putting questions in the chat, there were some questions that came up just after we were talking about how ICE gets information that I wanted to touch base on. One, we got a question about using the term non-citizens versus immigrants and whether that's a legal technicality. The reason that we wanted to use it in this training was just to emphasize that ICE is targeting for arrest people who are not US citizens. And of course, there are people who are immigrants in the US that are US citizens. So we wanted to just sort of clarify that and not put potential fear or concern for people who are immigrants and are US citizens. There was also a question in the chat about fingerprints going into state databases and some questions about what this might mean for sanctuary cities. Ali, I can start on this, and then if you have anything to add in, go for it. What I would say is in terms of fingerprint information from local policing, in New York, for example, there are policies in place to prevent local agencies, including our police, from cooperation with ICE. There are some limited circumstances where this is allowed, but because of the way that some of the state databases work in terms of our criminal justice database, and the generating of a rap sheet or information about someone's criminal history, the fingerprints are actually fed into the state database, and then the state shares them federally into a database that ICE has access to. And so what I would encourage is for anyone who lives in a jurisdiction that might have pro-immigrant policies, that might consider itself a sanctuary city, to connect with local organizers on the ground to see how is information shared. Is information shared through the city, and therefore it would be protected? So, if there are pro-immigrant policies in place, is fingerprint information actually shared through the state or in other ways that immigration might have access, even if it's not directly through the city? Ali, do you have anything to add on that?
No, but I can address the question about DMVs, Zhenya, unless you wanted to follow up. Great. So we had a question in the chat of, can we expand on how ICE gets DMV info? We will also either drop a link to explain this or send it out after, but just very briefly, one of the ways that ICE frequently gets DMV information is by querying state DMV databases for driver's license records. And they use a kind of information sharing system by law enforcement agencies that's called NLETS, or the International Public Safety and Justice Network, but most folks call it NLETS because that's a lot easier to say. And that has been around for about 20 years, letting ICE electronically query and retrieve driver's license information by participating state DMVs. There are some jurisdictions that are addressing that, which is a whole big follow-up, but in New York State, we have the green light law. Happy to drop in information about that as well. That is one effort. Part of green light is one effort to limit some of that sharing, but it's not totally complete. And there are a number of advocates working to follow up. Please let me know in the chat if that answered your question or not. And I'll pass back to Jenny.
Thanks. So we can go back. Great. We can go back to the slides and sort of talk about the last big topic, which are ICE policing trends, before we talk about how people can plug in and get involved. So before we get into this section, I just want to highlight some common ICE policing trends. You might be seeing these trends, you might be seeing other ones in your communities. So this is where a non-citizen comes on ICE's radar, be it through a criminal arrest where fingerprint information was shared, be it through fingerprint information that was shared through a different agency within DHS. ICE has identified that they want to arrest this non-citizen for deportation. Maybe they've conducted some digital surveillance through some of the tools that Ali talked about to figure out where to actually find this person. And I want to talk about what happens when they actually come to arrest that individual in person. The second training is going to go more in depth in terms of what are your rights during an encounter with ICE. So we're just going to highlight some of the common tactics where people may be arrested by ICE, what we're seeing on the ground. Next slide. And what we see is that ICE generally targets non-citizens at and around their homes. And so this might be that they're waiting outside of homes early in the morning, between 6 and 9 in the morning, to see who lives there, to kind of gather what their routines are, when they leave, when they come. One or two or more agents might knock on the door and yell police. Often they'll push their way inside when a door is opened. Even when a door is not open, they might threaten to break it down. ICE agents often arrest people on the street around homes as well, after people have actually left to go to work or court or to head somewhere. Occasionally, they might follow someone and arrest them at or around their workplace, especially if it's a public workspace. And normally, they'll call out someone's name to confirm their identity and then arrest them. And in all of these tactics that ICE uses, they are usually dressed in plain clothes, so they're not dressed in anything that identifies that they're immigration. They might look like anyone else on the street, and they often don't identify who they are before making an arrest, and sometimes they don't after they've made an arrest either. Next slide. ICE also makes a lot of arrests of individuals in cars. And so what happens is that ICE agents will be in unmarked cars, and sometimes they'll put on like a flashing light, or they'll pull a car over, kind of block a car on a road to stop a vehicle that they think are carrying a non-citizen they've targeted for arrest. And they may also question everyone in the car. They may ask for ID of anyone else there. Other common ICE arrest tactics include jail turnovers and cooperation from local law enforcement, or in some places from probation offices or parole offices. And this might look like someone who's in criminal custody. ICE might lodge a detainer. They might issue a detainer or a request for the jail or police to hold someone for ICE to arrest, or they might sort of loiter outside of the jails and in places to pick up individuals when they are released from criminal custody. Next slide. One thing that we see a lot of, and we're going to talk about this more in the second training, is that ICE agents are trained to mislead and lie to people using something called ruses, which is where they will pretend to be local police. And they do this by dressing in similar colors as local police, wearing vests that say police, actually saying we're police. They'll carry guns. They might, kind of pretend to be police conducting some sort of investigation, saying that they have a photo of a suspect they want to show someone, say that they're investigating a crime or asking to speak to someone about some sort of incident. And on this slide, we have 4 photos that were shared with IDP in 2020 at different points that were sightings of ICE agents either before or after they made arrests in the community. And so this is just some examples of ways that they dress to kind of hide that they're actually ICE and put forth that they're local police. Next slide, please. So we want to just include a few FAQs around ICE policing trends. These come up a lot. We get asked about whether ICE ever arrests people on the ground who they haven't actually pre-identified or targeted. The answer is yes. ICE may arrest witnesses who are present and vulnerable to deportation. They call these collateral arrests, so arrests of people who they haven't pre-identified. ICE may identify people in real time through using mobile fingerprint devices, through racial profiling, just asking people, do you have papers? Can I see your passport? And the thing I want to say about, these so-called collateral arrests is that this is a trend that kind of ebbs and flows with time. Recently, we haven't been hearing many reports of people who are witness to an ICE arrest being questioned and arrested, but this is something that has happened in the past, and it is something that is a tool that ICE has. And at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about how to get involved, including screening with an immigration attorney or having an immigration consult if you or a loved one or anyone in your community is afraid or concerned that they could be at risk of contact with ICE or in this scenario. Next slide. The second FAQ we included are questions that we get about whether or not any locations are off limits for ICE to make arrests. There is an ICE internal policy around protected areas, and Gabby's gonna put the link to the actual memo in the chat. But this policy instructs ICE agents to avoid arrests at or near some so-called protected areas, except for in limited circumstances. So the list of areas that are covered under this include schools, places where children gather, religious institutions and funerals, medical or mental health care facilities, social service centers, places for disaster and emergency response aid, parades, protests, and public demonstrations. And so we want to share this information so that people know that there's a low likelihood that an ICE arrest would happen at or near these protected areas. But we do want to comment that ICE, with the surveillance that they conduct, some of this digital surveillance that Ali covered, that they might still surveil protected areas. They might still, get a sense of how someone moves, where they're going, in terms of conducting some of their investigation to figure out where to find someone to make an arrest, an ICE arrest. And so if you've seen other ICE policing trends in your area, please feel free to put them in the chat. Again, we just wanted to cover some of the more common ones. I'll pause there before turning it over to Ali to see if there are questions before we talk about getting involved.
Great, thanks, Jenya. Just checking questions quickly. There is one of, do people who have entered with a tourist visa and overstay also appear? I believe that was in the ICE information section. Do you want to jump on that as I work on some other links for folks?
Yeah, why don't I jump on it? And it's actually a good segue into our last few slides about how people can get involved. So if you want to go to the next slide about just sort of one more slide. I'll kick us off here, and then Ali, if you want to pick up after this. So, the question about, people who enter on a visa and overstay, and I think the question is about if they would appear in an ICE database or if ICE would have their fingerprints. Anyone who's applied for a visa or had some sort of immigration status through the Department of Homeland Security has likely taken their biometrics in order to get that status, to get that visa, to get a green card, to get a work permit, whatever that is connected to. And so that information would be in the Department of Homeland Security's systems. And so we really wanted, before we talk about sort of ways that people can get involved more concretely on some of the surveillance sort of things happening that Ali mentioned, we wanted to just acknowledge that, immigration status can be really complicated. For some people, it's very clear. For many people, it's not. And a lot of people have a lot of questions about how this information could impact them, could impact their loved one, could impact community members. And what we would encourage is for people to get an individualized consultation to learn about their immigration status, if there are options to change their status, if they could be at risk of an ICE arrest. And we have a link in the slides, and Gabby, I believe, is going to put it in the chat, to the Immigrant Advocates Network. They have a national legal service directory, which has immigration legal service providers all throughout the country if you're not really sure where to turn to get an individualized consultation. And Allie, I'll turn it back to you for the next slide.
Thanks so much, Jenya. Just to wrap us up in 2 minutes, we know this was very rapid fire. This is the first of 2 sessions. We encourage you to come back same time next week. It will be a Know Your Rights focus session, so very interactive, a little bit different than our content dump today. But we do ask to help us finalize the content for our next session, that you fill out this very quick feedback form, which Gabby is going to drop into the chat now. It's a very quick form. It can be completely anonymous, helping us to know what resonated for you in this session, and also what you'd like to learn in the next session. So I challenge you positively to open that in another tab on your browser, on your device right now, and please do it in the 5 minutes after the session or by the end of today. Tomorrow, it would just really help us out. I also want to say that we will be sharing back the recordings and slides. Again, those will go out after the second session, but we know that there was an issue with capping the Zoom room today. So if you have colleagues, friends who couldn't join, we are following up with them by email to get them hopefully a recording sooner so that they can be prepped for the next session. And apologies if anyone was affected by that error on our part. And lastly, how to plug in. There is so much happening, especially on the local level. So as I'm chatting, I encourage others, if you're organizing at the local level or beyond and want to share resources or ideas or ways that people can get involved in the work you're doing, please put that in the chat. We are a room full of experts here. A couple ways you can get involved. We encourage you, like I said, to look at advocacy and local organizing in your area. The No Tech for ICE campaign on a national level is a great place to start, and Gabby will drop that in the chat as well. In addition to localized organizing against corporations, working with ICE. There's also a lot of protective policy work at the local level, rapid response collectives, bail funds, and more. So we have some resources for you in the chat, and we encourage you to drop in yours as well. And then again, next week, April 4th, we'll have our next session. Yeah, please go ahead to the next slide. If you have any questions that come up from today's session that we didn't answer, or other things you'd like to share outside of the feedback form, or you want to connect and learn more, feel free to email myself or Jenya. We've also included our organizational social media profiles in case you prefer to connect that way. We have a lot more resources, and we have a lot of collaborative campaigns going on, and would love to be engaged with all of you. Again, I'll ask Gabby to drop in the feedback form one more time. I'll turn it back to Jenya to see if there's anything else you want to say before we wrap.
No, just echoing Allie, thanks for those who could join us. We apologize for those who were trying to get in. We will get the recording to them, and thanks so much for the team behind the scenes helping to support us to do this. Maybe we can leave the last slide up with our contact information, and then and we'll end the Zoom in just a couple minutes. We'll leave that up for folks to write down if they want. Thanks so much.